Switzerland is the most famously, you might say infamously, neutral country in the world. That's why all the sketchy banking rules are there and people put their money there. Even in the hottest wars, they remain neutral. That is how Switzerland has survived. Even Switzerland is throwing its neutrality to the wind and coming out against Russia. They're not admitting that they're doing that, but they are doing that. They're joining on to sanctions against Russia. Switzerland, don't forget, we think of Switzerland as maybe the most quintessentially European country that there is. But Switzerland is not in the European Union. Switzerland is not in NATO. Switzerland is a neutral country. And yet, they're signing on to these sanctions against Russia. And it got me thinking here, what do we want? We in the West, we want everybody to be in the West, right? That's what all of the wars of the 2000s were about. All of the Bush wars were, okay, it was because Middle Eastern terrorists launched a war on us, and then that war was used, right? The attacks on September 11th were used as the justification for saying, okay, we can't just let these people live and let live, do whatever they want, because they're going to come to our shores too. So we're going to remake the whole world in the vein of Madisonian democracy. And we're all going to be the West, and we're all going to have iPhones and McDonald's, and we're all going to get along just fine. And it didn't really work out. Didn't work out very well in Iraq, didn't work out in Syria at all, certainly didn't work out in Libya, obviously didn't work out in Afghanistan, where we were just routed last year after 20 years mired in that backwater. It didn't totally work. Even here, this Vladimir Putin, who obviously wants to expand his empire, but he is using as the pretext for this war, he's saying the problem is NATO's expansion, Western expansion. In the early 1990s, at the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO said they weren't going to expand east. They did expand east. They expanded into former Warsaw Pact, former Soviet nations. We're not going to allow that. Ukraine is right up on our border. And you look at Ukraine. I suspect most people can't find Ukraine on a map. It's not your fault. Why would people pay attention to the maps of Eastern Europe? I suspect Joe Biden can't find Ukraine on a map because he doesn't know anything. That is his fault. He's the president. He should know where it is. But I bet Hunter Biden can find Ukraine on a map because he had a no-show job at the corrupt oligarchic energy industry in Ukraine. Adds even more complication to this issue. But Ukraine is right there between Europe, the EU, and Russia. Ukraine is a buffer state. There's a really good piece on this in Tablet Magazine by Lee Smith. Ukraine historically is a buffer state. And the thing about buffer states is they've got to play nice with the big powers on either side. When buffer states play nice with the big powers on either side, generally things are okay. But the minute that buffer states start to turn to one side or the other, then you see tensions begin to rise. And what you saw in Ukraine for the period before 2013, 2014, is that Ukraine was tilting pro-Russia. So then the West, through the encouragement of protests, through direct funding of protests and activist groups, the West turned that government in Ukraine a little more pro-Western, actually a lot more pro-Western, actually so pro-Western that they wanted to join NATO and they wanted to join the European Union. All of a sudden, Russia says, we can't have this. We cannot, maybe we can tolerate NATO expanding to Poland or Hungary or to some of those Eastern European states, but we can't tolerate them right up on our border. So all of a sudden, even when you think you're going to solve a problem by having Ukraine join NATO, what could be the downside of that? This is great. All of a sudden now, you've gotten Russia into the sort of situation where they feel that it's in their essential security interest to go in and you have war. This is something that very hawkish, very serious, very well-respected foreign policy thinkers in the 1990s warned NATO about. They said, do not expand NATO eastward. George Kennan, he's the author of the Long Telegram. He's the author of The Strategy of Containment, the Cold War strategy for containing communist Russia. He said it's a huge mistake. It's a tragic mistake to expand NATO eastward. You are going to squander the victory of the Cold War. You're going to create a new Cold War. That's what we're seeing happen right now. I'm so glad you liked that clip. Now you got to ring the bell. Ring the bell, subscribe, get the notifications. Especially, this is what you really got to do. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you get your audio podcasts. Do it right now. I'll wait. You got it out? Good. Type in The Michael Knowles Show. Subscribe, leave a 5-star review. We'll see you next time.